Okay, we're going from this book here, The Best of the West in Art, Music, Movies, and Books by me, Pete Rogers. We're on page 219. We're talking about the ancient Romans, okay? So the last lecture was all about the great things the ancient Greeks did. Now, the ancient Romans did some good things. The biggest thing that was good about the ancient Romans was their republic. There were three main categories of Roman government. There was 500 years approximately a monarchy, then 500 years a republic was sort of their most noble high point. Subsequent to that was the 500 years of empire, okay, beginning with Augustus, Octavian, Augustus, Caesar. Okay, and the most important person to know in all of Roman history is Cicero. If you just study Cicero, you'll come into contact with everything else you need to know about Rome. But the greatest thing about the Roman Empire is it enabled Christianity to spread very rapidly all throughout the Mediterranean and adjacent regions, the known civilized world of that time. Here's a good quote by Henry Sienkiewicz from his novel Quo Vadis, spoken by Petronius, the patrician advisor, aristocrat advisor of Nero. He said, "The Greeks taught us poetry, the Romans taught us power, and the Christians taught us forgiveness on a large scale." And that is true. Okay. The Greeks developed man's mind, the first sophisticated philosophy and reasoning of mankind. Rome was, administrative authority and organization, their ability to run this giant empire. Okay, first achievements of the Roman Empire. They had a few great writers and thinkers. Cicero is the best, perhaps the greatest orator of all time. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, that was nice. They had some big-time historians like Livy. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic, was one of the better rulers, okay? The Romans developed and spread the Latin language throughout the empire. We still basically use the Roman alphabet. Latin provided a common language for scholars, for about 1,500 years. Many modern languages come from Latin. Italian, the Romance languages, Roman for Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. And even though English is sort of considered a Germanic language, it also was greatly influenced by Latin. Okay, the next big thing the Romans did, they constructed an extensive road system. And it was sort of said that all roads lead to Rome, via Romaniae. To help them control their empire, they needed good roads so they could march their troops out to quell anything that annoyed them, enable their military to travel quickly. They had sentries and distant outposts that could quickly send information back to Rome by horseback if they needed to. They improved greatly the skill and the use of concrete for building roads. But in some ways they were kind of stupid. We would consider them stupid. Despite having horses, they didn't invent the stirrup. That came later by the Christians of the Middle Ages. Okay, they didn't invent the high back saddle. You didn't have knights that could joust until in the Middle Ages, the Christian men of Europe developed the high back saddle and the stirrup and the horse shoulder plow. See, the reason why the Industrial Revolution never occurred in ancient Rome is because they had slave labor. There was no incentive to innovate and use windmills or water wheels or other types of machinery or develop it because you had a bunch of slave labor. Slave labor was very cheap. And they weren't really that great of an economy. They were a slave economy and a tribute economy. They conquered all these surrounding peoples and they demanded taxation and tributary from them. But they didn't develop them. They really didn't develop much. And that's why the great historian Rodney Stark said it was good that the Roman Empire fell, because the Middle Ages was actually rapid technological and intellectual achievement in comparison with the Romans. He felt it was stagnation due to a slave economy. Okay. There was a joke from the movie The Life of Brian with Monty Python. He said, John Cleese said this, he said, apart from better sanitation and education and irrigation and public health and roads and fresh water and public order, what have the Romans ever done for us? Okay. They had a very sophisticated, by standards of that time, legal system with the premise that a person was innocent until proven guilty, equality before the law, so that was all good. They needed a standardized legal method, to manage their vast empire. The greatest of the Roman lawyers was Cicero, of course, one of the greatest orators of all time. Here's one painting of Cicero. This comes from the time of the denouncing Catiline, who had a conspiracy to overthrow the Roman rule. Okay. Here's another painting of Cicero speaking before the Roman Senate. This painting was by Cesare Maccari. This one by Hans Schmidt. They're beautiful. Okay, another big thing, because they developed a form of republican government. Okay, so they had learned something from the ancient Greeks and from all the other places that they conquered and from their own personal experience. And they had a representative rule, with consuls and senators and tribunes, and that was good. And later on, with more time, the plebeians got more power, and the plebeians needed to have some power. Okay, that's just like the common people, the peasants of the more modern age. Okay, patrician was like a word for Roman aristocrat. And this is a great improvement over the dictatorships all surrounding them in the ancient world. Okay, so here's a quote by Cicero. The republic, when we inherited it, was like a beautiful painting whose colors were already fading with age. But our time not only has neglected to freshen it by renewing the original colors, but has not even bothered to preserve its forms and outlines. What now is left of the ancient customs on which the Commonwealth of Rome was firmly founded? They have been so utterly buried in oblivion, they are not only no longer practiced, but they are forgotten. Cicero was a great man. He was trying to bring back the Roman Republic, trying to bring back freedom to Rome. And other sort of savvy politicians like Julius Caesar saw that the Roman Republic wasn't coming back. And he helped form a triumvirate between Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. And they had asked Cicero to join them. And Cicero should have joined them, but he didn't want to. He still clung to this idea of being able to restore the Republic. And that later on led to his death, that Cicero did not join them. And it also led to a civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey. Okay, and Julius Caesar won that civil war. Okay, Crassus had already been killed when he was trying to establish military glory and conquest. He's sort of jealous of Julius Caesar in that sense. Okay, anyways, the greatest book to learn about Rome is, first of all, you'd watch the course by Rufus Fears. He's got the best introductory lecture on the ancient Romans. Gregory Aldrete has a pretty good lecture on the ancient Romans as well. But then you would want to read the trilogy of books about Cicero by Robert Harris. You can listen to them as audiobooks. They're magnificent. Okay, construction of the aqueducts. The Romans did a great job with that. They had developed the aqueducts and underground sewage system, extraordinarily advanced for that time. Here's a painting, Pont du Gard, Roman Aqueduct by Robert Hubert. They made construction of magnificent sports coliseums. Here's a painting of the Roman Colosseum and other monuments by Giovanni Panini. All those vowels, and I love those Italian names. 1735, beautiful. Okay, here's a painting at the Colosseum by Lawrence Alma Tadema. He painted a lot of great scenes of Rome. So did Panini. Okay, the fanfare, the spectacle. Here is Chariot Races by William Trago. Okay, there's a lot of beautiful paintings about the Roman chariot races. Here's another one. This one by Ettore Forti. Reminds me of the chariot races in Ben-Hur. The movie has the best chariot racing scene ever. Okay, they're entering Circus Maximus. Okay, and here's Thumbs Down in the Colosseum, painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme, the French painter, 1872. Kind of a scary painting. Yeah, like Edith Hamilton had said, the Greeks would play. They would have competitions of the Olympics, every 4 years. But that was not like the ancient Romans. The ancient Roman gladiator matches, those were not played. The guys, very often died. Okay, that's not playing. That's pretty serious stuff. Some people think that the USA is, again, having more MMA and all this other stuff as a way to mimic the ancient Romans and to mimic their fall in an effort to make USA collapse faster. Nero's fire in 64 AD. Nero burned down all these buildings in Rome, about a third of Rome, because he wanted to build his own stuff. It's a way to free up land, okay? Painting by Hubert Robert there. And then he blamed it on the Christians, and that led to big-time Christian persecutions. So here's the Christians being thrown to the martyrs in the Roman Colosseum and, being crucified and burned alive as torches. And the Romans would sing, Christus vincit, Christ will conquer. And the Roman stadium audience was so impressed by the magnanimity, the confidence, the behavior of the Christians in the face of this persecution that they started converting more and more to becoming Christian. Everybody wanted to be like the Christians because they were so good. They led by example. The pagan priests were kind of boring and people didn't really like them very much. There was no sense of community. With the Christians, they were a strong community. They helped each other. They were nice to each other. They gave the women tremendously increased rights compared to what a woman had in marriage under Roman paganism. Okay, so the people just, and they lived by example of helping each other, being nice to each other. So everybody wanted to become Christian. That's why Christianity took off. It took off more because of the sense of community, I think, than because of the message of Jesus Christ, even though, of course, the message of Jesus Christ is what shaped the whole thing. But people basically said, the Christians are good, the Christians are nice, the Christians are brave. I want to be like them. The Romans were sort of shallow and cruel and petty. You can read all about this in the books by Rodney Stark. You can read all about it in the novel Henry Sienkiewicz. Okay, Nero's torches. And, Nero is such a scumbag. He would, have the Christians tied to a tree pole, and then they would burn them as torches for light at night. Okay. The Romans were very cruel. Here's a superior use of the dome in architecture, pretty sophisticated architecture. The Pantheon, pan meaning all, theon meaning religion, God. So a building as a tribute to all the gods of paganism. Painting by Giovanni Panini, 1734. And Pythagorean math was used to help build the Pantheon. And the Romans recognized that the Greeks were intellectually superior to all the peoples that they had conquered. The Greeks had the most sophisticated literature, their theater, their drama, their philosophy, of course, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and all the other ones, Parmenides, Pythagoras, Anaxagoras, there's tons of them, okay? The schools, the skeptics, the cynics, Diogenes. All right, the Stoics. Let's go to the next one. They had the first newspaper. It was called the Acta Diurna, the Daily Act, or Acta Publica, the Public Act. And it was begun by Julius Caesar from 59 BC, continued on to 222 AD, printed on stone or metal, and it was posted publicly so people could read it, and then people would read it out. Okay. And it would be incorporated into the historical documents of ancient Rome. So they kept their history, and that's why historians can come along later like Livy, and they could read all the different stuff that had been recorded. The Romans made the first bound books called the Codex. The ancient Greeks used scrolls for the written documents. The wealthy Roman aristocrats had their own libraries of books. Okay, now here's a good quote. It said, a Roman citizen who was lucky enough to be free and possessed of a little bit of money. This is from Charles Murray in his book Human Accomplishment. He said, lived a life that in many ways was competitive with any that followed, with modern Western aristocrats. If he wished to study history, he could read Thucydides, Herodotus, or Plutarch. If he wished to study philosophy, he had before him, in more complete form than we do, the works of Plato and Aristotle. If he wished for literature or drama, he had available to him the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Oresteia, the Oedipus plays, Antigone, Electra, Medea, Lysistrata, the Aeneid, and more. Our Roman citizen had easy access to these works. Rome under Antonine boasted over 25 public libraries with books that could be checked out for reading at home. The affluent bought rather than borrowed books, and this was easy enough since booksellers abounded, and they bought in profusion. No house of any pretension, Seneca wrote, lacked a library with shelves of rare cedar wood and ivory from floor to ceiling to contain their books. Okay, so the Romans were pretty sophisticated, and you need to have an aristocracy and people that have enough free time that they can read and study. Rome developed the most sophisticated military of its time, organized into legions. Okay, here's Trajan's column celebrating another one of their conquests, painting by Charles Eastlake. Here's a painting of a detail, it was actually a detail, of Emperor Trajan's column, made in 113 AD, showing the Roman soldiers in what was called a turtle formation, where they put their shields above their head to protect themselves from arrows or other things thrown, like, for example, during siege warfare. The biggest badass of all the Roman generals was Julius Caesar. He's like one of the biggest badass people who ever lived. And he was a genius. Rome was a nation of generals and military conquest, and he's the greatest Roman general who ever lived. There was a reason why everybody admired and feared Julius Caesar. Okay, the famous story of Julius Caesar, he was a young guy in the military, and he was on leave, and he was kidnapped by some pirates. And the pirates, wanted to charge a ransom for Julius Caesar. And he said, that's not enough. I'm a great man. You should charge a higher ransom for me. And they did. And they got the money. And Julius Caesar was set free. And Julius Caesar said to the pirates who kidnapped him, he says, I want you to remember my face. I am going to come back after you, and I am going to capture every one of you, and I'm going to crucify you. And he did. He got a bunch of people to help him. He came back. He searched until he found the pirates who had kidnapped him, and he crucified every one of them. Okay? That's a typical Julius Caesar story. Okay? And then he wanted to be the great general. He went into Gaul, and he crushed Gaul. Gaul was very powerful. Vercingetorix had been trained by the Roman military. He knew their tactics, and he was a brilliant leader, but Caesar just kicked their butts, man. And this is Vercingetorix and the Gauls surrendering to Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar probably killed about 1 million Gauls. He was brutal, and he did a lot of brutal things. I'm aware of it. You can read about it in Julius Caesar commentaries. Okay. Here's another painting of Vercingetorix surrendering to Julius Caesar. Painting by Lionel Rover. The earlier one was by Henry Paul Motet. Okay. And I want to share with you a quote by a historian. This is Tom Holland. He wrote a book called Dominion, a book about how Christianity came to dominate the world. When he was a young man, he was very enthusiastic about the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. And a lot of young guys feel that way. And to some extent, Ayn Rand felt that same way, that the ancient Greeks were so cool. They were so smart, so tough, so awesome, kind of. You can't study the ancient Greeks without admiring a lot about them. Don't get me wrong, there were some bad things about them too. But especially a young guy, they were awesome ability. They fought off the Persians. They did all these great things. And then the Romans kind of scare you and how brutal and cruel they are, but you still are kind of in awe of Julius Caesar, okay? But here's what happens. You get a little older, you get a little wiser, and you realize life is more than just being macho and strong at 20 years of age. And here's what Tom Holland said. When I was a young man, I admired the ancient Greeks and Romans more than the Christians. Okay, a young guy will think the Christians are a bit of pussies. Okay, same thing Ayn Rand thought they were a little bit of pussies. A lot of people thought that way. Nietzsche thought that Christians were pussies. Okay, he says, the ancient Greeks and Romans seemed more exciting. However, with more experience, I started to see things differently. As I was studying the ancient Romans, I realized they were quite foreign to me. Julius Caesar killed 1 million Gauls, and he didn't seem to have any remorse about it. This did not resonate with me. I've realized that my value system was not like the ancient Greeks and Romans. My value system was Christian. Okay, so that's a common thing. If people get a little older and wiser, they'd like to see peace in the world. They don't like all this brutality. You play sports when you're young, and it's fun to play sports, but you get a little sense of how can people get along and be nice to each other. And the Christian message, it works. Love thy neighbor. Give each other the benefit of the doubt, forgive, be nice, tell the truth, get along. Okay. Here was a great book by Edith Hamilton, The Roman Way. She wrote The Greek Way and The Romans Way. Okay, and of course she loved the ancient Greeks much more than the ancient Romans. But she gave credit where credit was due and talked about the great ones, Horace and Cicero and some of the other great ones and the things they did, Octavian, what he did. Okay. Here's her other book, Edith Hamilton, The Greek Way. Now that's a better book because the ancient Greeks are just a lot more interesting than the Romans. Okay, here's a quote by Edith Hamilton. The spirit of the West, the modern spirit, is a Greek discovery. The Greeks were the first Westerners. The ancient world, insofar as we can reconstruct it, it bears everywhere the same stamp. In Egypt, in Crete, in Mesopotamia, a despot enthroned whose whims are the determining factor, a wretched, subjugated populace, a great priestly organization to which is handed over the domain of the intellect. This is what we know as the Oriental state today. It has persisted down from the ancient world through thousands of years, never changing in any essential way. A tomb in Egypt and a theater in Greece. The one comes to mind as naturally as the other. The ancient Roman world pointed back to the old world, to the east, with its emperors who were gods, who fed a brutalized people full of horrors as their dearest form of amusement. Yeah, the Romans were brutal. Okay. Another example, just the brutality of the Romans. For example, there was a slave revolt, and then Crassus helped put down the slave revolt, and he would crucify a slave like every 500 yards along the Appian Way leading into Rome just to send a message to any other slave or any other person. This would not be tolerated. That's just how brutal the Romans were. That'd be a typical thing for the Romans to do. Okay, Edith Hamilton continues. Athens and Rome had little in common. That which distinguishes the modern world from the ancient, and that which divides the West from the East, is the supremacy of the mind in the affairs of men, and this came to birth in Greece, and it lived in Greece alone of all the ancient world. The Greeks were the first intellectualists. To rejoice in life and to find the world beautiful, that was a mark of the Greek spirit, which distinguished it from all that had gone before. The Greeks were the first people who played. They had Olympic games and theater. The Romans did not play. The gladiator fights were not play. They were brutal and sadistic. Up and down the coast of Asia Minor, St. Paul was mobbed and imprisoned and beaten. In Athens, however, they brought him into the Areopagus and said, "May we know what this new teaching is." The fundamental fact about the Greek was that he had to use his mind. The ancient priests of the other lands said, "Thus far and no farther. We have set the limits on thought." The Greeks said all things are to be examined and called into question. There are no limits set on thought. Yeah, the Greeks are awesome. You'll love the Greeks when you study the Greeks. If you actually learn about them, how they went from nothing to being these sophisticated thinkers, to Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, three of the greatest philosophers who ever lived. They're extraordinary. And Archimedes, and a lot of other great men in ancient Greece. Okay, so some things about why did the Roman Empire fall. Part of it was they started using lead for plumbing in their pipes, and that started driving down their IQs. They became decadent, okay, with a lot of stupid behavior. This painting is called Romans in Their Decadence by Thomas Couture. The waning age of the Emperor Augustus and the rising age of Christianity with the birth of Christ, okay, by Jean-Léon Gérôme. And that symbolizes, in a sense, too, USA and the Western world. We're either going to have a return to Christian ethics and Christianity, or we're going to return to barbarism with widespread poverty and slavery. And unfortunately, that's the way it's going right now. The word legare means to ligate, and that's where religion comes from. Religion comes from the Latin word relegare, to religate. A ligation, a ligature, is a suture, to tie something together. So religion ties the people together, gives them a shared common history and values that they can all relate to. And Christianity, including the Old Testament, New Testament, the Ten Commandments, and the message of Christ, that what you do to the least of my brethren, you're doing to me. So respect the individual, the poor, the weak. And if you do that, everybody ends up better off. It ripples outward, the goodness from it. Anyways, without religion, you always end up with an atheism and dictatorship. It's pretty well known if you study history. Here's a painting, The Sack of Rome, by Karl Briulov, okay, 1830. And around the time of the sack of Rome and the fall of Rome, St. Augustine was writing The City of God, that it would be preserved, okay. And Boethius is probably the last great Roman scholar, fluent in multiple languages, who knew the classics well. So anyways, that's it for the ancient Romans. I hope you found that helpful.